Anthony Blackwood had never been told no by anyone who mattered. At 28, he was already the youngest vice president in the history of Meridian Enterprises, a position he had secured not through merit alone, but through his father's connections and his family's substantial investment in the company. His corner office on the 45th floor overlooked the city like a throne room, and Anthony ruled his domain with the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. The employees at Meridian, called the security team the Royal Guard, partly as a joke about their military-style uniforms and rigid protocols, but also because they seemed to take their duties as seriously as palace guards protecting a kingdom. These weren't ordinary security officers hired from a temp agency. They were former police officers, military veterans, and trained security professionals who maintained order in one of the city's most prestigious corporate towers. Anthony had grown up believing that money and family name could solve any problem, open any door, and bend any rule. His father, Richard Blackwood, owned construction companies, real estate developments, had political connections that reached into the highest levels of government. The Blackwood name carried weight in business circles, and Anthony had learned early that throwing around his family's influence usually got him whatever he wanted. On this particular Tuesday morning, Anthony arrived at Meridian Enterprises in a foul mood. His Ferrari had been towed from a no-parking zone. His credit card had been declined at an expensive restaurant the night before due to a banking error, and his personal assistant had called in sick, leaving him to handle his own scheduling for the day. These minor inconveniences felt like major disasters to someone accustomed to having every aspect of his life managed by others. The trouble started when Anthony tried to bring his guest, Rebecca Martinez, up to his office without following proper visitor procedures. Rebecca was a model he had met at a nightclub, and he wanted to impress her with his corporate power and influence. The last thing he wanted was to wait in line at the security desk like some ordinary visitor. Officer James Crawford, a 20-year the veteran of the police force before joining Meridian's security team, was stationed at the main checkpoint. Crawford had seen every type of entitled behavior during his career, from drunk celebrities to corrupt politicians, and he had developed a reputation for treating everyone equally regardless of their status or connections. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood," Crawford said professionally. "I'll need your guest to sign in and receive a visitor's badge." Anthony barely slowed down as he approached the checkpoint. "That won't be necessary, Crawford. She's with me." Crawford stepped forward, blocking their path with calm authority. "I'm sorry, sir, but company policy requires all visitors to register and receive proper identification. No exceptions." The word exceptions hit Anthony like a physical blow. In his world, exceptions were the rule. Special treatment was something he expected and usually received. The idea that a security guard would dare to obstruct his path seemed impossible to comprehend. "Do you know who I am?" Anthony demanded, his voice rising loud enough to attract attention from other employees passing through the lobby. Crawford's expression remained neutral. "Yes, Mr. Blackwood, I know exactly who you are. But company policy applies to everyone, including executives and their guests." Rebecca shifted uncomfortably beside Anthony, clearly embarrassed by the scene he was creating. Other employees were stopping to watch, some pulling out their phones to record what was obviously going to become office gossip within minutes. Anthony felt his face burning with humiliation and rage. This uniformed nobody was treating him like a common visitor, enforcing petty rules that clearly weren't meant to apply to someone of his importance. The eyes of his employees were on him, watching to see how the powerful Anthony Blackwood would handle this challenge to his authority. "Move aside, Crawford," Anthony said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "I don't have time for your bureaucratic nonsense." Crawford remained motionless, his hands clasped behind his back in a military stance. "Mr. Blackwood, I need you to step back and allow your guest to complete the registration process. This is standard procedure for everyone." The word everyone was the final insult. Anthony wasn't everyone. He was special. He was important. He was a Blackwood, and Blackwoods didn't wait in lines or fill out forms or follow rules designed for lesser people. What happened next would become the defining moment of Anthony's life, though he couldn't have known it at the time. consumed by rage and humiliation, driven by a lifetime of getting his way through force of will and family influence, Anthony made a decision that would change everything. He placed both hands on Crawford's chest and shoved hard, trying to push the security officer out of his way. Crawford barely moved. The older man's solid frame absorbed the impact without difficulty, and he looked down at Anthony with an expression of mild disappointment rather than anger or surprise. "Mr. Blackwood," Crawford said quietly, "you've just committed assault on a security officer. I'm going to need you to step back immediately." The lobby of Meridian Enterprises fell silent, except for the hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of elevator bells. Anthony stared at Officer Crawford, suddenly realizing the magnitude of what he had just done. The security officer's calm demeanor was more unsettling than if he had gotten angry or physical in response. Other members of the Royal Guard appeared with remarkable speed. Officer Sarah Martinez emerged from behind the main security desk, while Officer Thompson moved to block the elevator access. Within 30 seconds, Anthony found himself surrounded by 3 trained security professionals who showed no sign of intimidation or concern about his family name or corporate position. "Sir, I need you to place your hands behind your back," Crawford said, his voice remaining steady and professional despite having just been assaulted by a company executive. Anthony's mind raced as he tried to process what was happening. This wasn't how things worked in his world. When he acted out or crossed lines, there were always people to smooth things over, make phone calls, arrange settlements that kept problems quiet. His father's lawyers, the company's public relations team, and his family's political connections had always managed to make his mistakes disappear. "You can't arrest me," Anthony said, his voice cracking slightly. "I'm a vice president of this company. My family has investments worth millions here, officer." Martinez spoke for the first time, her tone matter of fact. "Mr. Blackwood, your position in the company doesn't change the fact that you just committed assault. We're detaining you until the police arrive." The word police hit Anthony like a bucket of cold water. Real police, not corporate security, that could be influenced or intimidated. Real consequences that couldn't be bought off or negotiated away. For the first time in his adult life, Anthony was facing a situation where his family's money and influence might not be enough to protect him. Rebecca had backed away during the confrontation, clearly wanting no part of whatever was about to happen. She looked at Anthony with a mixture of disgust and embarrassment before walking quickly toward the exit, leaving him alone to face the consequences of his actions. "Look, Crawford," Anthony said, his voice taking on a pleading tone that surprised even him. "This is all a misunderstanding. I was just frustrated about the delay. Surely we can work this out between us." Crawford's expression didn't change. "Mr. Blackwood, you put your hands on me with the intent to move me out of your way. That's assault under state law. This isn't something I can ignore or work out." Other employees had gathered at a safe distance, some recording with their phones, while others whispered among themselves. Anthony realized that video of his breakdown was probably already being uploaded to social media, where it would spread through the business community within hours. The powerful Anthony Blackwood, reduced to begging a security guard for mercy. Officer Thompson had contacted the city police, and Anthony could hear him speaking quietly into his radio. "You have a situation in the main lobby of Meridian Enterprises. Adult male, mid-20s, assaulted a security officer. We're requesting units for arrest and transport." The reality of his situation began to sink in as Anthony heard the word arrest spoken aloud. He was going to be arrested, processed through the criminal justice system, and charged with a crime. His name would appear in police reports and court documents. The media would pick up the story. His father would find out, along with everyone else in their social and business circles. "This is insane," Anthony said, his voice rising again. "I barely touched you. You're ruining my life over nothing." Crawford's response was measured and calm. "Sir, I didn't ruin your life. You made a choice to use physical force against someone who was doing their job. Actions have consequences, regardless of who you are or what you think you're entitled to." The words "what you think you're entitled to" cut deep because they were accurate. Anthony had spent his entire life feeling entitled to special treatment. to having his way, to being above the rules that governed ordinary people. The royal guard was showing him that his sense of entitlement was an illusion, and that reality operated according to different principles than his privileged worldview. That felt like hours passed before the elevator doors opened and two police officers stepped out. Detective Williams and Officer Brooks approached the group with professional efficiency. Taking in the scene and immediately understanding the situation from Crawford's brief explanation, "Mr. Blackwood?" Detective Williams asked, consulting his notepad. "I understand you assaulted this security officer. Is that correct?" Anthony's mouth opened and closed several times before he found his voice. "It wasn't assault. I just... I was trying to get past him. It was barely a push." Detective Williams exchanged glances with Crawford, who nodded confirmation. "Sir, I'm placing you under arrest for assault. You have the right to remain silent." The detective began reading him his Miranda rights. Anthony felt his world collapsing around him. The handcuffs were cold against his wrists, and the click as they locked seemed to echo through the marble lobby like thunder.
Ow.
Every employee in the building would know by the end of the day that Anthony Blackwood had been arrested for assaulting a security guard. The county jail processing center was unlike anything Anthony had ever experienced. The fluorescent lights were harsh and unforgiving, the concrete floors cold beneath his expensive Italian shoes, and the smell of disinfectant mixed with human desperation filled his nostrils. For someone who had spent his life in luxury offices, exclusive restaurants, and private clubs, this institutional environment felt like being dropped onto an alien planet. Anthony's one phone call went to his father's personal attorney, Marcus Goldstein, who had been handling Blackwood family legal matters for over 20 years. Goldstein's reaction to the news was a mixture of disappointment and professional concern that made Anthony's stomach clench with anxiety. "Anthony, what were you thinking?" Goldstein asked, after Anthony explained the situation. "Assaulting a security officer. This isn't a traffic ticket or a tax issue. This is a criminal charge that could have serious consequences." "But you can fix this, right?" Anthony asked desperately. "Make it go away like you always do?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "This is different, Anthony. The assault happened in front of witnesses, probably on security cameras, and with multiple employees recording on their phones. The victim is a respected former police officer with an exemplary record. This isn't something that can just disappear." The words hit Anthony like physical blows. For the first time in his life, his family's money and influence weren't going to be enough to erase his mistakes. He was going to have to face the consequences of his actions like any ordinary person who had broken the law. Goldstein continued, his voice taking on the tone he used for serious legal matters. "I'll arrange for bail and get you out of there as quickly as possible, but you need to understand that this case is going to proceed through the courts. We'll fight it, of course, but you assaulted someone, Anthony. There are going to be consequences." After hanging up, Anthony was led to a holding cell where he spent the next 8 hours surrounded by people whose lives were completely different from his own. Drug dealers, drunk drivers, shoplifters, and various other defendants awaiting processing shared the cramped space with the heir to the Blackwood fortune, Carlos Hernandez, a middle-aged man arrested for driving with a suspended license. Struck up a conversation after noticing Anthony's expensive suit and obvious discomfort with their surroundings. "First time?" Carlos asked with a knowing smile. Anthony nodded, embarrassed by how obvious his inexperience with the criminal justice system must be. "What are you in for?" Carlos continued, not unkindly. I pushed a security guard at my office," Anthony admitted, the words feeling strange in his mouth. Carlos whistled softly. "Assaulting a security officer? That's serious business, hermano. Why'd you do it?" Anthony tried to explain about being frustrated, about the visitor procedures, about feeling disrespected, but as he spoke, the reasons sounded increasingly petty and ridiculous. Carlos listened without judgment, occasionally nodding as if he understood something Anthony was only beginning to grasp. "You know what your problem is?" Carlos said when Anthony finished his story. "You never learned that respect isn't something you can demand, it's something you earn." The comment stung because it echoed what Officer Crawford had tried to tell him in the lobby. Everyone in this cell, regardless of their circumstances or the charges against them, seemed to understand something about life that had completely escaped. Anthony, despite his expensive education and privileged upbringing, when Goldstein finally secured his bail later that evening, Anthony was released into a world that felt fundamentally different from the one he had left that morning. News of his arrest had already spread throughout the business community, and his phone was filled with messages from reporters, colleagues, and social media notifications that made his stomach turn. The drive home in Goldstein's car was conducted in uncomfortable silence until the lawyer finally spoke. "Your father is flying back from London tonight. He wants to see you first thing in the morning." Anthony's heart sank. Richard Blackwood's disappointment was something he had managed to avoid for most of his life, but there would be no escaping it this time. The family name that had opened so many doors for Anthony was now associated with a criminal assault charge and viral videos of his breakdown in the Meridian lobby. "How bad is this going to be?" Anthony asked quietly. Goldstein sighed. "The criminal charge is one thing. We might be able to get it reduced to a misdemeanor with community service and anger management classes. But the damage to your reputation and your family's business interests, that's going to be much harder to repair." Night Anthony sat in his downtown penthouse apartment, surrounded by luxury that felt meaningless in light of the day's events. The city lights twinkled below his floor-to-ceiling windows, and he could see the Meridian Enterprises building in the distance, its upper floors illuminated against the dark sky. For the first time in his life, Anthony began to question everything. He had been taught about power and influence. Officer Crawford had shown more real strength in his calm response to being assaulted than Anthony had ever displayed in his worst moments of rage and entitlement.
Ow.
The security officer hadn't needed to raise his voice, make threats, or call in favors. He had simply done his job with dignity and let the consequences speak for themselves. Anthony realized that what he had always thought of as power, the ability to intimidate others, to bend rules through influence, to get his way through force, of will or family connections, was actually just the illusion of power. Real power, he was beginning to understand, came from something completely different. Richard Blackwood's home office was a monument to success and intimidation. The walls were lined with awards, photographs of him with politicians and celebrities, an expensive artwork that spoke of wealth accumulated over decades of ruthless business dealing. When Anthony entered the room the next morning, his father didn't look up from the financial report spread across his mahogany desk. "Sit down," Richard said. His voice carrying the quiet authority that had built a business empire and terrified competitors for 30 years. Anthony took a seat in the leather chair facing his father's desk, feeling like a child called to the principal's office. The silence stretched between them until Richard finally looked up, his expression combining disappointment, anger, and something that might have been fear. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Richard asked, his voice deadly calm. "Not just to yourself, but to this family and everything we've built?" Anthony started to speak, but his father cut him off with a raised hand. "I've spent the last 12 hours on the phone with board members, investors, and public relations specialists, trying to contain the damage from your tantrum. The video of you assaulting that security officer has been viewed over 2 million times. Our stock price has dropped 3 points. Two major clients have called emergency meetings to discuss their continued association with Blackwood Industries." Each word felt like a physical blow. Anthony had never seen his father this angry. Anthony was beginning to understand that the consequences of his actions extended far beyond his own criminal charges. Richard continued, his voice growing harder. "With each sentence, that security officer you pushed around, James Crawford, do you know anything about him?" Anthony shook his head, realizing he had never bothered to learn anything about the man he had assaulted. 20 years with the police department, decorated veteran, his 2 tours in Afghanistan before that. He's respected throughout the security industry and has letters of commendation from every company he's worked for. He volunteers at a homeless shelter on weekends and coaches Little League baseball for underprivileged kids. The description hit Anthony like a sledgehammer. He had attacked a genuine hero, a man who had served his country and dedicated his life to helping others, simply because Crawford had the audacity to ask his guest to sign a visitor log. Meanwhile, Richard continued, you're known throughout the business community as my spoiled son who got his position through family connections rather than merit. Who do you think the public is going to support in this story? Anthony felt sick to his stomach. The contrast between Crawford's character, his own, was so stark that it made him question everything he thought he knew about himself. I'm suspending you from your position at Meridian pending the resolution of the criminal charges, Richard announced. Your corporate credit cards are canceled, your company car is being returned, and your access to all Blackwood family business interests is revoked until you demonstrate that you've learned something from this disaster. The punishment was more severe than anything Anthony had ever faced. Being cut off from the family business meant losing not just his income, but his entire identity as a Blackwood heir. Dad, please, Anthony began, but Richard stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. You want to act like you're above the rules that govern everyone else? Fine. But you're going to learn what it's like to live without the protection of the family name and the influence you've taken for granted your entire life. Over the following weeks, Anthony discovered what it meant to be ordinary. Without his corporate position and family support, he was just another defendant in the criminal justice system. The same legal system that had always seemed like a minor inconvenience for someone with his resources was now a grinding bureaucracy that treated him like everyone else. His court-appointed attorney, since he could no longer afford Goldstein's fees, was overworked and unimpressed by his former status. Public defenders saw cases like his everyday privileged individuals who thought their money or connections would protect them from the consequences of their actions. The prosecutor is offering a plea deal, his attorney, Linda Chen, explained. During one of their brief meetings, misdemeanor assault, 6 months probation, anger management classes, and community service. What kind of community service? Anthony asked. Chen consulted her notes. The judge is suggesting you work with a program that helps former inmates reintegrate into society. Specifically, you'd be working with men and women who are learning to control their anger and make better choices. The irony wasn't lost on Anthony. He would be learning alongside people who had made far worse mistakes than his own, but who were genuinely trying to change their lives. Meanwhile, he was still struggling to accept that he had done anything wrong. During this period of isolation and legal uncertainty, Anthony began receiving unexpected visitors. Carlos Hernandez, the man he had met in the holding cell, stopped by his apartment one evening with food and conversation. "How are you holding up, Hermano?" Carlos asked, settling into Anthony's expensive couch like they were old friends. Anthony found himself opening up too. Carlos in ways he had never been able to with his wealthy friends or family members. Carlos had grown up in poverty, made mistakes. That landed him in jail multiple times, and was now working 2 jobs to support his family while staying clean and sober. "You know what I learned from my mistakes?" Carlos said one evening. "Real strength isn't about getting your way or making other people do what you want. It's about controlling yourself when everything goes wrong." Anthony thought about Officer Crawford, who had demonstrated exactly that kind of strength when faced with an angry, entitled executive. Crawford had remained calm, professional, and focused on doing his job correctly, even when being physically assaulted. "I made the biggest mistake of my life that day in the lobby," Anthony admitted. Carlos nodded. "The question is, what are you going to do about it? You can keep feeling sorry for yourself, or you can figure out how to become the kind of man you should have been all along." The community service center was housed in a converted warehouse on the rough side of town, far from the gleaming corporate towers and exclusive neighborhoods where Anthony had spent his privileged life. The walls were painted institutional green, and the fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he reported for his first day of court-mandated service. Program Director Maria Yi Santos greeted him with the kind of no-nonsense attitude Anthony was learning to respect. Santos was a former social worker who had dedicated her career to helping people rebuild their lives after hitting rock bottom. She looked at Anthony's expensive clothes and knew immediately what kind of person she was dealing with. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, consulting her clipboard, "you'll be working with our anger management and life skills program. Your job is to help set up chairs, serve meals, and assist with whatever tasks need to be done. This isn't a networking opportunity or a chance to feel good about yourself by helping the less fortunate. These people have real problems, and they don't need your pity or your judgment. Anthony nodded, chastened by her directness. Over the past month, he had grown accustomed to people treating him without the deference he had once taken for granted. The program participants were men and women from all walks of life who had made mistakes that landed them in the criminal justice system. Some were dealing with addiction, others with mental health issues, and many were simply trying to learn better ways to handle anger and frustration without resorting to violence. During his first group session, Anthony found himself sitting in a circle with people whose stories made his own problems seem insignificant. Michael Torres had lost his job and family after a bar fight that resulted in assault charges. Jennifer Walsh was learning to control her temper after years of domestic violence that had escalated to the point where she attacked her abusive boyfriend with a kitchen knife. When it was Anthony's turn to share his story, he felt embarrassed by how trivial his assault on Officer Crawford seemed compared to the genuine struggles of his fellow participants. "I pushed a security guard at my office because he asked my guest to sign a visitor log," Anthony said quietly. "I was angry and frustrated, and I thought I was above the rules." The group's reaction surprised him. Instead of judgment or mockery, he saw recognition and understanding. These people knew what it felt like to let anger control their actions and to face consequences they never expected. "What did you learn from it?" asked David Kim, former construction worker who had been arrested after threatening his supervisor during a dispute over unpaid wages. Anthony thought about the question carefully. "I learned that I don't know anything about real power or real strength." Dr. Patricia Williams, the therapist who led the anger management sessions, helped Anthony explore the roots of his entitled behavior. Through weeks of group therapy, he began to understand how his privileged upbringing had insulated him from the normal consequences that teach most people how to behave in society. "You've lived your entire life in a bubble where your actions rarely had meaningful consequences," Dr. Williams explained during one of their individual sessions. "When someone finally held you accountable, you didn't know how to handle it." Anthony began to see patterns in his behavior that extended far beyond the incident with Officer Crawford. He had bullied subordinates at work, treated service staff with condescension, and used his family's influence to escape responsibility for countless minor infractions throughout his life. "I want to apologize to Officer Crawford," Anthony told Dr. Williams during one session. "I don't think he wants to hear from me." "Why do you want to apologize?" she asked. Anthony considered the question. "Because I understand now that he was just doing his job, and I attacked him for it. He showed more character in 5 minutes than I've shown in my entire life." Through Maria Santos, Anthony learned that Officer Crawford volunteered at the same community center on weekends, helping with a job training program for former inmates. The security officer was teaching men and women how to present themselves professionally, how to interview for jobs, and how to rebuild their lives after making mistakes. The irony was overwhelming. The man Anthony had assaulted was spending his free time helping people who had made far worse mistakes than Anthony's own, giving them the tools they needed to become productive members of society. One Saturday morning, Anthony arrived at the community center to find Officer Crawford setting up chairs for a job skills workshop. The security officer looked up when Anthony entered, his expression neutral but not hostile.
"Oh, Mr. Blackwood,"
Crawford said quietly. "I heard you were volunteering here." Lakeitha Anthony's heart pounded as he approached the man he had assaulted months earlier. "Officer Crawford, I wanted to apologize for what I did. There's no excuse for my behavior." Crawford studied Anthony's face for a long moment before responding. "I appreciate that, Mr. Blackwood. How are you doing with the program?" The question caught Anthony off guard. Instead of anger or resentment, Crawford seemed genuinely interested in Anthony's progress and well-being. "It's been hard," Anthony admitted. "Learning about myself, I mean, realizing how wrong I was about everything." Crawford nodded. "That's the beginning of real change. It takes courage to look honestly at your mistakes." Over the following weeks, Anthony found himself working alongside Crawford during the weekend programs. The former police officer never mentioned their confrontation, instead focusing on teaching practical skills to people who needed second chances. Watching Crawford interact with program participants, Anthony began to understand what real power looked like. The security officer commanded genuine respect through his consistency, his knowledge, and his willingness to help others. People listened to him not because they were afraid of him or because he could influence their careers, but because he had earned their trust through his actions. 1 year after his arrest, Anthony stood before Judge Margaret Harrison for his final probation hearing. The courtroom was nearly empty, except for a few court officials and, to Anthony's surprise, Officer James Crawford, who had come to observe the proceedings. "Mr. Blackwood," Judge Harrison said, consulting the file before her. "I see that you have completed your community service requirements, attended all required anger management sessions, and have received exemplary reports from your supervisors at the Community Service Center." Anthony nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and accomplishment that he had never experienced during his years of corporate success. "Your probation officer reports that you have continued volunteering at the center even after completing your required hours. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Anthony replied. "The work there has become important to me." Harrison smiled slightly. "Mr. Blackwood, when you first appeared in my courtroom, you struck me as someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. Today, you seem like a different person entirely. What changed?" Anthony thought about the question carefully. "I learned the difference between having power over people and having the strength to help people." After the hearing concluded and his probation was officially terminated, Anthony found Officer Crawford waiting in the courthouse hallway. "Congratulations," Crawford said, extending his hand for a handshake. "You've come a long way." Anthony shook the offered hand, still amazed by Crawford's lack of resentment or anger about their original confrontation. "I owe you an enormous debt," Anthony said. "If you hadn't held me accountable that day, I never would have learned these lessons." Crawford shrugged. "You did the work, Mr. Blackwood. I just enforced the rules that everyone else has to follow." Afternoon, Anthony met with his father for the first time in 6 months. Richard Blackwood's office looked exactly the same, but Anthony saw it differently now. The symbols of wealth and influence that had once impressed him now seemed less important than the character and integrity he had been learning to develop. "You look different," Richard observed, studying his son's face. Anthony had lost weight during his year of community service and self-reflection. More importantly, he carried himself with a quiet confidence that came from genuine accomplishment rather than inherited privilege. "I want to come back to work," Anthony said, "but not in the same capacity as before." "Hey!" Richard raised an eyebrow. "What did you have in mind?" Anthony had spent months thinking about this conversation. "I want to start a program that helps people with criminal records find employment. Partner with companies throughout the city to give second chances to people who are genuinely trying to change their lives." The proposal was not what Richard had expected. "It doesn't sound very profitable." "It's not about profit," Anthony replied. "It's about using our resources and connections to solve real problems for real people." Over the following months, Anthony launched the Second Chance Initiative through Blackwood Industries. The program connected formerly incarcerated individuals with entry-level positions at companies throughout the region, providing job training, mentorship, and ongoing support to help them successfully reintegrate into society. Officer Crawford became one of the program's volunteer mentors, using his experience and natural teaching ability to help participants develop the professional skills they needed to succeed. The security officer's involvement lent credibility to the initiative and helped convince other law enforcement professionals to support the program. Carlos Hernandez became one of the program's first success stories, landing a job with a construction company and eventually working his way up to supervisor. The man who had befriended Anthony in the jail cell now spoke at program orientations, sharing his story and encouraging new participants to take advantage of the opportunities being offered. Anthony's transformation didn't go unnoticed in the business community. Articles in trade publications highlighted the Second Chance Initiative as an innovative approach to corporate social responsibility, and other companies began implementing similar programs. But the recognition that meant the most to Anthony came during a program graduation ceremony when Maria Santos pulled him aside. "When you first showed up at the Community Service Center, I thought you were just another entitled rich kid serving out his sentence," she said. But you've become one of our most effective advocates. These people trust you because you've been where they are. Looking out at the graduation ceremony, where dozens of men and women were celebrating their successful completion of the job training program, Anthony felt a sense of accomplishment that dwarfed anything he had achieved during his corporate career. Officer Crawford approached as the ceremony concluded. "You should be proud of what you've built here," the security officer said. Anthony shook his head. "I couldn't have built any of this if you hadn't shown me what real strength looks like. When I pushed you that day, you could have pushed back. You could have humiliated me or made me look foolish. Instead, you stayed professional and let the system work." Crawford smiled. "The badge and the uniform don't make someone powerful, Mr. Blackwood. Character makes someone powerful. And character is something you have to choose every day in every situation." As Anthony drove home that evening, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. His assault on Officer Crawford had been the worst mistake of his life. But it had also been the catalyst for becoming the person he was meant to be. He had learned that true power wasn't about getting your dead way or intimidating others into compliance. Real power came from having the strength to do what was right, even when it was difficult. It came from helping others succeed, from taking responsibility for your mistakes, and from treating every person with dignity and respect regardless of their position in society. The Royal Guard at Meridian Enterprises had taught him a lesson that no business school or family fortune could provide. That genuine authority came not from what you could take from others, but from what you could give, to help them become better than they were before.